To all of you joining us from around the world, a very good morning, or evening as the case may be. I'm Justin Scott from Temasek Polytechnic in Singapore, bringing you our second live webinar for 2016. This webinar series is brought to you jointly by the Singapore Training and Development Association, better known here in Singapore as STADA, and the Center for Transcultural Studies at Temasek Polytechnic. Through these webinars, we seek to create a platform for knowledge sharing by connecting thought leaders from around the world. This morning or evening, I'm delighted to introduce you one such leader, Dr. Britt Andreatta, the Director of Learning and Development at lynda.com, which is now part of LinkedIn, as well as a Senior Learning Consultant at LinkedIn. Dr. Andreatta has a unique background. She brings over 25 years of experience in leadership, psychology, education, and the human sciences. She's authored several titles on leadership, learning, and management, many of these available on as courses on lynda.com. She's even written a textbook, Navigating the Research University, which is currently in its 3rd edition. She's contributed to entrepreneur.com, Business Insider, Practical Business Training. She's a certified coach and has given TEDx talks. A former professor and dean at the University of California, Antioch University, and Pacifica Graduate Institute, she designed and led the Leadership Development Program at UC Santa Barbara. Currently, as I've mentioned, she has several courses on lynda.com, and her new book, Wired to Grow, Harness the Power of Brain Science to Master Any Skill, is available now on Amazon.com. I could go on about her accomplishments, but I hope you're also convinced, as I am, that we have a distinguished expert with us here today. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Dr. Britt Andreatta to begin her presentation. Britt, over to you.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate that wonderful welcome, and I'm happy to see everyone. I think a few people have some rustly papers going on, so if you want to check for muting yourself, that's awesome. I'm going to jump into my deck. I've got about 40 minutes of information that I'm going to share. I promise it'll be interesting and engaging because I am so fascinated by this research myself. So I'll share that with you, and then we'll have plenty of time to kind of talk about it, ask questions. And as we're going along, feel free to use the chat box to ask questions. Justin's going to keep tabs of those. But of course, if there's anything wrong, like the slides are not forwarding or whatever, we'll figure it out and keep things moving. But we did test drive this, so it should work. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to get into the presentation. And Justin, can you confirm that you can see that?
Yep, looks good on this end.
Fantastic. Okay, so as Justin mentioned, I've been a little busy the last few years. I do have several courses on lynda.com, and after this presentation, I'll be able to send you an email with a link to a free trial if you haven't yet checked it out. I've also been publishing lately in the neuroscience space. My book, Wired to Grow, is out on Amazon, and a print version will be out shortly. I also did an article in the Talent Development magazine in the fall, 6 tips for working with the brain. And I also have a guide on creating a culture of learning. So I can send you some of these things afterwards as part of an email. And we're going to just jump into our roadmap for today. So what we're going to look at is, what does change look like in today's workplace? And more importantly, what happens to the brain on change? We know that change affects the brain in many ways, and I'm going to share with you that information because we know that resistance to change is strong, change fatigue is real, and it's all about habits. So we'll get into some of the details of that. And then I'm going to leave you with some strategies to maximize the adaptability of your talent, because change is not going to go away. In fact, it's coming faster and more furious. But we can all have some new strategies for helping people maximize their adaptability as they go through these changes. So today, change in today's workplace, it looks a lot of different ways. So it can look like you have a new job or a new role or move to a new team. That's a whole set of changes. It can look like you got a new manager, some new colleagues joined your team, or perhaps you have a new leader of your function or even the whole business. Perhaps your company is introducing some new technology or switching software or introducing a new process or procedure. That's a type of change. Perhaps your company is playing with a new product or service and you're going to be launching something new that you will be responsible for producing. Perhaps you're moving into a new country or culture. Whether your company is moving there or you yourself start to do business in those areas, that represents a huge change. Perhaps your company is moving into a new market, a new territory, or going after a new type of customer. Those are all kinds of changes that you might be navigating. And perhaps you're part of a new company, or there's a new culture and you have a new future. I recently just went through this. It was about a year ago that I showed up to work one day and it was announced that LinkedIn had bought our company. And super excited, really respect LinkedIn, but thrown into a lot of changes instantly with no prediction whatsoever that it was coming. So I feel like I have just been going through pretty much all of these changes and can share intimately what it was like on the front side, but also as a researcher and someone who teaches change, having a real understanding of like, oh, I'm going through that right now. So I hope to kind of share both the personal journey and also the why of the journey in this presentation. So the other thing we know is that the pace of change, it's not like it happens slowly, right? I mean, it's fast-paced. Even if it's only driven by changes in technology, that is driving things pretty quickly. It's constant. We're always going through change. And in addition, change is happening across multiple channels. We might get a new boss, be working on a new product, and have to operate in a new territory all at the same time. So what it means is change is really everywhere. We're constantly dealing with it, particularly if you look at the health of the whole talent pool that you have. What is the net effect of all that change? And the net effect is that change fatigue is real. Many of you have seen it, many of you have experienced it, but it's real. People get exhausted with change. And exhaustion looks one of two ways. It can just be the physical exhaustion of one person going through a change. This happened to me the first 6 weeks of LinkedIn. I was literally exhausted by 2 p.m. every day and you know, making my way to the hotel and just falling down on the bed, and that was literally all I had in me. And then over time you get a little bit more comfortable, right? You start to get you know, strong and used to the change. But if you have a lot of change come at you one after another, pretty soon you get fatigued with just the constancy of change. So there's 3 things going on here, and we're going to do a deeper dive, but the biology of this is real. So the first is we do have an emotional response to change that we cannot really control. It's because we are biologically wired to resist change. So when it happens, we have a whole series of emotions that we have to go through as we make peace with that change. And then in addition, as we're going through that process, as we're adapting, there's physical and mental energy required to adapt. And so all of those things are not something we can change about ourselves. They are part of our human wiring, but they're at play all the time when you're rolling out change in your organization. So the first part of this, let's talk about the emotions of change. I actually talk about this in one of my lynda.com courses called Leading Change, and it's the change curve. And so a lot of researchers have looked into what happens when people go through a change, and there's a curve, and it's predictable. So let me kind of walk you through it. So the change process unfolds over time, and you have productivity and morale kind of on your left axis there. And when the team is doing well and they're kind of humming along, they have normal productivity. But a change gets, you know, introduced. It's the desired state, whether that's we're going to increase our market share, we're going to roll out a new software, we're going to reorg this function, whatever it is, the leaders expect mistakenly that you're going to go from current state to this higher level, higher performing state in a straight line, and everyone's going to be excited about it and have energy for it. Well, that is not what happens at all. In fact, you know, the biology of all of this is what drives the change curve. But what really happens is when you have a change announced, people have a dip in productivity and morale, and then eventually, after they've spent a little time going down, they can turn around and start heading back up. So when change is announced, your company's been purchased or you have a new job, you have first feelings around shock, denial, and anger because it maybe wasn't something that you chose. So all of this stuff comes from studies. So they have found that humans consistently have these series of emotions at these stages in the change curve. As you go on in the curve, you're likely to see some emotions of apathy and frustration. So people are still trying to figure out what the change is. They're still emotionally processing it. And why these emotions are difficult is because, this first part of the slide is really about seeing change as a threat. It's going to change something I like. I'm going to lose something that I'm comfortable with now, so there's resistance to it. As you hit the bottom of the curve, that's when the transition happens. And you maybe still have confusion and listlessness, but there's not so much anger and denial. The transition is really important, and two things happen at the bottom of the curve. This is when people are likely to quit. They're likely to quit the job or the company, or the leaders give up on the change that they were initiating because they're so startled by everyone's negative reaction that they give up, when really people need a little more time to keep moving through the change curve. The role of the leader can be really important here because you can help with the transition. And when change is led well, you can shorten the time frame and you can lessen the depth of the dip. But you cannot make it go away altogether. You can just make it a little more palatable. But once the transition happens, then employees go on and start moving up and embracing the change, and they eventually get to excitement and high energy, and they get to the desired state, but it does not happen right away. So that's the change curve, and you'll notice that the first part of the curve is really, employees are focused on the past and what the potential losses are, and you know you've hit the transition point because they start to think about the future and considering potential gains that might come from the change. And this is why, if you've ever rolled out a change, you hear things like, it's too ambitious, we don't have the equipment, that's someone else's responsibility, it's not my job. This needs another, we need more thought. This is another department's, problem. If you've ever rolled out change, you've heard these things. If you've ever gone through change, you've said these things. And so we can kind of predict based on what people are saying, what part of the change curve they're in. And that can be also interesting because not everyone goes through the change curve at the same pace. Some people move through it quickly and are embracing it, and then you've got some people who are really resistant and are still pretty negative, and they can be in the same meeting saying very different things about the change. So let's now turn our attention to the biology of all of this, because this to me is really fascinating and has really changed how I teach change and how I also approach change myself, because I understand more of what's going on. So neuroscience, first of all, is just about how the central nervous system, that's your brain and your spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, that's all the other nerves in the body, they play a key role in how we respond to and move through change. That's just how we're wired. And if you think about ourselves as a species, we're really wired to do three things. We're wired to survive. We have entire biological structures designed to help us detect danger and respond to it so we survive. If we are surviving, then we move on to belonging. We need to be part of community. We need to feel like we're part of an organization or a family or a team. We survive when we are in community with each other. And then finally, we are wired to become, grow, develop, become our best selves. All three are important, but you cannot get to the become part if you're stressed out about surviving and belonging. And change often messes with our focus on survival, belonging, and becoming. It triggers it. So because of all of that, we are biologically predisposed to resist change. It's just the nature of humans. And I think one of the first things we can do is all embrace that. Like, oh, whenever we're rolling out change, no matter how awesome our team is, they're biologically predisposed to resist it. So I need to plan for that. I need to allow time for that, and I need to have patience for that. So let's look at what's going on a deeper level. I want to introduce you to a few concepts and a few brain structures that are really active when we're going through change, because I think it's going to give you the bigger picture of how to make change go better. So we're going to look at fear, learning, place, habits, and failure, and there's different brain structures that play with each of these. So the first is fear. Biologists have discovered that our brain actually has 3 layers to it. The reptilian layer, the gold layer is the limbic layer, and the neocortex is the green layer. And these actually evolved over time. And the red layer is our reptilian brain. It's the one that's focused on survival. Then our emotional brain is the yellow part, and it's more where we have more nuanced emotions. It's really focused on belonging and those connections to other people. And then the neocortex is where our logic analysis and critical thinking live. It's where our self-awareness is. It's what distinguishes us from all the other species, except for cetaceans. Whales and dolphins also have a very complex thinking brain. So the amygdala is the part of our brain that has to do with fear. It's buried in the reptilian brain, and it's the part responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze response. So if today you were driving and a car swerved near you, you would have felt that go off. And it literally is that, it's 200 milliseconds, super fast. And when the amygdala is triggered, it can flood your body with adrenaline and cortisol instantly. And it does all kinds of great things to the body to help you survive. It increases your heart rate, it expands your lungs, it gets you ready to fight the danger, run away really fast, or become really still so you're not detected. So again, it goes back to our survival mechanism. Really interesting, when we're in the amygdala, we're in this fight, flight, or freeze response, our neocortex or thinking brain goes offline. So we lose our logic analysis and we lose our ability to have self-awareness. Now, what's really interesting is that change always affects the amygdala and signals potential danger. And I know this may be hard to kind of wrap your head around, but if you think about when we lived on the, on the plains, we were a hunter-gatherer species. If we noticed that that bush over there looks very different than it did yesterday, we were more likely to survive, because behind that bush could be a lion waiting to jump out to get us, or an enemy. And if we just ignored it, we were more likely to not survive. So our biological wiring is designed to have us notice change and see it as potentially threatening until we check it out and discover that it's not. So that's one thing to notice. Change is always going to bring up some fear and anxiety in people because it's biologically wired to do so. If you have not yet seen the animated movie, The Croods, I encourage watching it because it does a great job of kind of showing this in action, plus it's funny. But the family's father, his whole motto is never not be afraid. And it really just shows how important this aspect is to our survival and how really our species only made it because of folks who were more attentive to potential danger. So the second structure of the brain I want to introduce you to is the hippocampus, and it's responsible for learning, and it's also responsible for memory. So the hippocampus, if you look at this diagram here, that blue structure, the hippocampus are the prongs that go up and they unite the left and right hemisphere of the brain, and then that little knobbly thing that almost looks like a bunch of grapes, that's your amygdala. And they are physically attached. So the amygdala is physically attached to the hippocampus. The hippocampus essentially records events. So when you're learning something, for example, this webinar right now, if you're focused, if you're paying attention, your hippocampus is making a recording of it. And then it gets pushed into short-term memory and eventually into long-term memory if you process that information in a certain way. So learning is something that we do all the time. Many of us are in the business of learning. My whole book is on the neuroscience of learning, so I talk about what are all the brain structures as we go through a learning experience. But what's really important to know is that change always requires learning. Even if it's, okay, I'm learning a new product, I'm learning a new team, I'm learning the new rules of a company, it always requires learning. So the hippocampus is involved in change. What's really interesting here is that the hippocampus is somewhat sensitive to stress. So if we're under a lot of stress and we have a lot of adrenaline and cortisol in our bloodstream, what happens to the hippocampus is it degrades. It starts to shrink and get less effective when you're constantly under stress. Simultaneously, the amygdala gets bigger. It grows when you're under a lot of stress. So if you think about teams that are under a lot of stress for a sustained period of time, they get more trigger happy and reactive to all kinds of stimuli. and their ability to learn and adapt goes down. This is why highly stressful jobs, people burn out, because you literally cannot sustain it. You're not physically able to sustain it. And I think we can recognize that when we think of like military teams out in a war zone. Like, of course, we're all going to realize they're under a lot of stress. People who work in really high demanding jobs like emergency room personnel. But what you may not realize is that in a lot of our modern workplace office environments, we're recreating high levels of stress by the sheer volume of change we're asking people to endure. All right, so the third interesting thing about our brain and change is that our brain has a way of tracking place. And this research is from Britt and Edvard Moser. They're from Norway, and they won a Nobel Prize for this work. But they discovered that part of the hippocampus includes this entorhinal cortex. And how that functions is it's our internal GPS. We literally have a part of our brain that creates mental maps of locations and how we move through them. And the research is really fascinating. They've actually attached electrodes to rats and watched them walk around space. And as they're walking around, they noticed that these cells were firing off in a very measurably detailed grid. In fact, it was very precise, the grid, how these cells were firing off, and in fact, it's a 3D grid. So these cells, there's different kinds of cells. There's cells that mark the longitude and latitude and kind of map the physical movement of the rat through the space. That same entorhinal cortex can track the direction the rat is moving. And when the rat hits a boundary like a wall, it's marked. The cell does something differently. So that literally when the rat is done moving through this space, in their brain, there is a physical mental map in their cell structure. And when they move them to a new location, they have to create a new mental map. And they've discovered that humans do this too. So what's really interesting here is that change almost always involves navigating new space. If you think about moving to a new office or moving to a new location, you oftentimes or even just moving from one building to the next, you may be erasing the physical map that you had and having to create a new one. So we lose that mental map and have to spend energy creating a new one. Now, our brain can do that, but it does take physical energy for the brain to map that new physical space. So it's part of why you get exhausted when you're going through a lot of change. Now, interestingly, in addition to physical space, that same part of the brain maps social space. So we create mental maps noting our relationships with people, and we start to figure out who's got what power, who seems nice, who seems distant, and we make literal mental maps as well in our brain as we're navigating social space. So what's really interesting here is it's all about relational learning, right? How we learn how to engage with people. It's kind of part of our emotional intelligence too. If you realize this person has a lot of power, you're gonna know how to orient yourself to him or her. And if someone is not nice to you, you're gonna learn to avoid them. So we know that this is also affected by change. We shift our relationships. You're put on a new team, you have a new boss, you're interacting with new customers. You now have to do the work of losing the mental map that you had and building a new one. So again, part of why change is exhausting. And then another part of the brain that's really involved, and if any of you have seen some of my neuroscience of learning stuff, I talk about habits there too, because habits is how we do most things. So the part of the brain here is the basal ganglia. It's the blue part of the structure, and it's not actually blue, but it's called out blue in this drawing. So our basal ganglia is the wonderful part of our brain that helps us adapt to change. So think about when you were learning to drive a car or doing something complex. It took a lot of mental energy, just thinking about the gas and the brake and the mirrors and the wheel and doing all that. It took a lot to concentrate on that. Well, what the basal ganglia does is when it notices that we're doing some activity over and over again, it starts to say, oh my gosh, this is taking a lot of energy. Let's see if we can reduce the energy. So the basal ganglia's job is to take tasks that we repeat over and over again and strip them down to a very routinized thing our brain can run without using any energy. And they've actually measured this on MRIs. They can see the energy used by the brain when someone's doing a new task, and after a certain number of times doing that task, the energy use goes way down on the MRI, and that's a sign that the basal ganglia has kicked in and has done its job. So it reduces the energy it takes. This is also why after you've been in a new role or in a new company for a certain number of weeks, it gets easier, right? You've built all those new maps, you've figured out the new routines, and your brain has routinized them, so now it's all taking less energy and you're not so tired. Change creates habits. And here's what's interesting is oftentimes when we're working in our offices, and let's say we're switching a sales team from one type of software to another, we're taking them away from a habit that's already well grooved, comfortable, and doesn't take much energy, and we're introducing a new habit that's going to be awkward and difficult and takes a lot of energy. So let me tell you a little bit more about habits. Habits exist as habit loops. There's always a trigger. I'm walking to my car. And then the trigger sets off the behavioral routine. I'm going to do this series of things called driving, push the gas, turn the wheel, etc. And there's a reward for doing the behavior. In this case, I get to my destination. The basal ganglia will only really design a habit loop if it sees a reward for doing the behavior. So if you think of most things in our companies, like the order arrives, we process the order, the reward is getting money. You know, we show up to work, we do our job, the reward is getting a paycheck. And that reward then anchors the loop so that the next time the trigger comes along, you start doing the loop. And the more times you go around this loop, there's repetition here. Once you hit a certain number of times, that's when the basal ganglia takes in and then makes that whole thing take a lot less energy. Well, when you think about change, we take that sales team and we change their software. So we erase the habit loop that they had that was comfortable and well grooved, and then we have to install a new one. But most of the time we don't do a very good job of that. We don't really help them learn the new behavior. We may talk about it, we announce the change, and we say on this day you're using the new training or the new software, but that's where the power of training comes in, is that you could actually build in to the training using the software a certain number of times in the training session so that you get that habit loop built, as opposed to letting them kind of do it on their own. And then the final structure of the brain I want to introduce you to that's related to change is the habenula. It's near the thalamus, and it's related to failure. So what the habenula does is it releases serotonin and dopamine. Those are both chemicals that cause us to feel good, and a certain amount in our body makes us feel good, and when they're restricted, we feel bad. The habenulin sends out these chemicals in response to success and failure. So if you're doing things right and you're having success, whether that's a task or navigating a relationship, it will send out serotonin and dopamine. And when you're failing, you're screwing up, you're getting criticized, it will restrict those chemicals so you go into a feel bad state. So failure is designed to make you feel bad. And in fact, they've actually measured this on people. They have a person sitting there getting a negative critique of their work performance, and the habenula is hyperactive in that moment. The reason our bodies are designed to do this is that, again, if you go back to our hunter-gatherer days, it's kind of like built-in guardrails. It's helping our brains make better decisions and take the right actions so we don't repeat failures. Because our survival was dependent. If going down this one trail never leads to food, we should stop going down it, and we should be instead drawn to the 3 trails that lead us to food. So again, they all have really clear biological reasons, but this means that failure can actually create a negative response for employees. And change obviously has lots of opportunities to fail, right? For all the reasons I already mentioned, we're developing new habits. So there's lots of opportunities to fail when you have a new boss. There's opportunities to fail when you're trying a new skill. And so then our brain is making us feel bad for all those failures. So you can start to see how several of these brain structures are kind of adding on to each other to make a more complete picture. And to me, it's not at all surprising that 70% of change initiatives fail. we're actually biologically wired to not be great at change, and unless you know that as a leader, and unless you're actually designing your change initiative and training to support that, you're going against human biology. And I think this is where, I think there's millions of dollars in this understanding right here, because if we can work with the brain and we can work with our biology, we can shift how much change fails. We can make it more successful, and we can have people feel better about it. The other thing I think that's interesting here is that a lot of change has unintended consequences besides the one I just mentioned. I know a lot of us care about employee engagement. But if you remember, engagement is defined as how much people are emotionally connected to and committed to their company. Well, when you start to go through lots and lots of change, and then you're failing and you're feeling bad, and then you start to adapt and you start to succeed, and then you change again, you can only go through that so many times before it starts to erode employee engagement. So poorly managed change ultimately causes the employee to disconnect emotionally, because they just can't keep going through getting excited and then disappointed and worried and failing, because it's just too difficult. Okay, so I'm not going to leave you with all negative news. I just want you to understand the reality of how strong our wiring is to resist change. But there's definitely things you can do to help your employees succeed. So we're going to talk about those. And the high level here is how we lead change, how we shift from goals to problem solving, how we can measure fatigue, how we help people increase their adaptability, and how important learning is in the whole process. So leading change, super important, right? Leaders set up the whole process for success. And so leaders actually need to have some skills around how to design the change correctly from the beginning, how to communicate that change, how it's coming in a way that reduces the impact and the stress to the employees, and then to ultimately implement that change in a way that supports that transition, makes it easier for employees to get on board, and makes that process smoother and faster. But a lot of our leaders are out there doing change with no training in change management, right? We need to teach them what good change looks like and how to do it. And I do have a course on that in lynda.com, Leading Change. There's lots of great change management models out there, but we really have to make sure that our leaders have that skill set. In addition, leaders oftentimes are the ones designing the change, but the managers play a very important role because they're on the front lines in those day-to-day relationships with the employees, and they need to have the skill set to also play their role in change management, as well as being able to help the employees move through the transition. So we know as a result of this, emotional intelligence is a vital skill. So change management and emotional intelligence are two skills I think all leaders and managers need to have immediately. And what shocks me when I go into organizations is that, oftentimes we have management and leadership training, and it's oftentimes broken into level 1, level 2, level 3. And change management is almost always saved for a higher level leader, when really everybody needs change management, and they need it almost their first day. So rethink where you're putting change management training. First of all, you should be putting it somewhere, and second of all, you should be moving it earlier in the process, because when we look at how people, again, go through this change curve, managers are the ones who are going to help manage that transition and get people through the bottom of the dip and up to the higher levels of productivity and morale, and helping them turn that attention. And if they don't have emotional intelligence or the ability to manage change, they're not going to be very good at it, and then they're probably adding fuel to the fire as opposed to helping. So another area you can kind of focus, another strategy, is to consider shifting your attention from goals to problem solving. And here's why. Goals, like when we have people set goals, and if you think about most change, it's kind of rolled out as a goal map. Like, okay, in phase 1, we're going to do A, B, and C. In phase 2, we're going to knock out 1, 2, and 3. Goals tap into our need for control and stability. So the minute we have a list of we're going to check all these things off, they can kind of set up that anxiety and fear. And also, if it doesn't go well, it's activating all that failure. If you instead have folks think about problem solving, right? Instead of checking off the list, here's the problem, let's figure out how we're going to solve it. You actually shift the attention to the reward-seeking part of the brain, and you turn people on to finding their way through, and that's much more proactive and positive, particularly if you have folks think about how to design, how to iterate, how to solutioneer. So again, oftentimes leaders design the change, announce it, and start implementing it, where if they put parameters for the change, but then empowered and enabled the actual employees to participate in the problem solving, it would change their entire relationship to how they're moving through the change. It creates buy-in and ownership, and it taps into a whole different part of the brain. Another thing you're going to want to do is measure fatigue. I love this photo because I think we all know someone who finally hit their limit, right? I mean, we all can kind of know who on our team is getting crispy. They're getting stressed, and they're not their best self anymore. And we may have someone new to the team who's super excited to be there, and someone who's kind of middle, and then somebody who's really kind of on their edge. And then depending on how you're treating an entire team, you can have a whole bunch of your team who's in a fragile state. So some things here is to just start thinking about, do you track change? Most organizations that I consult with, they don't. They design it, they implement it, they maybe even measure it, but there's nobody tracking net change. So I encourage you to start thinking about this, because you want to look at what amount of change are you asking your people to endure in a 6-month or 12-month window, and look at all of it. You know, maybe there's a reorg happening, and you rolled out some new software, and you changed the travel policy, and maybe you opened up a new office. That would be fine if that's spread out across many teams, but you could have a team that's having 6 changes all at the same time. That's a lot, and it's a lot. Biologically, they just can't do it that long and do it well. In addition, you want to look at the pace of change. How fast is it coming? We know that there's certain things we can't really control, but there's a lot of things we could be more mindful of if we were paying attention, you know? And, you know, how fast are you stacking change on top of people? And is there time in between those changes to recover? Again, you know, I know people who are on their 5th manager, their number 5 manager in a 12-month window. That's just a lot, right? And if particularly those manager changes are coming quickly, it's adding a lot of additional anxiety. So you want to look at how much, how fast, and then how big is the change? What's the impact? You know, if you've got a team who has a beloved leader and they're all thriving, and that leader leaves, that impact has more weight than maybe changing a phone system on them. But if you start to realize that one team not only lost a leader, they moved into a new building, and they had to change phone systems, it's like, you know, there's a lot going on for this team. If we think about relocating people, right, we oftentimes relocate our talent. Not only are they changing their job, they're changing homes, they're changing schools, their partners might be changing. That's a lot of change that they're enduring 24/7, not just during work hours. So what I'm arguing for here is you need to start tracking it, because if you start mapping these changes, you'll have a heat map, and you'll have a better sense of who is likely to start to struggle, where you're going to probably have disengagement. It's really no surprise that the teams that are reorged the most and have the most change hit change fatigue, they start to disengage, and then they leave. And if you're doing that to your top talent, you're costing yourself a lot of unnecessary drama, as well as stressing them out. There's lots of things we can do to help people be resilient with change too. There's a lot of things that help humans respond to and move through change better. So I want to give you some of those, because these can also be things you're thinking about in your company. So you definitely want to help people ride the waves of change, right? Change is not going to stop. In fact, it's going to get faster. So we got to give people the skill set to ride it and move through it, as opposed to stopping it. These include involving those who are impacted by the change. Again, that's kind of the problem solving, but people are far more resilient if they get to play a role in designing or implementing the change, as opposed to it just be putting upon them. And it changes how they move through the change curve. They move through it more quickly and in a more empowered way. Another thing you can do is empower that problem solving, like I mentioned earlier. Oftentimes leaders who are not the front line and won't be living the change, they figure it all out and then they announce it. Where if you say to the group, you're going to be the ones that are going to have to live this change, so we want you to help us design it, then they're in the problem solving mode, and you're also getting really fantastic data from the people who probably know the most. What are the real impacts? Mindfulness. So there's tons and tons and tons of research. I can't even tell you how compelling the research is on the power of mindfulness. And mindfulness looks a lot of different ways. Some typical ways it looks in business is introducing things like meditation classes, yoga, and other mindfulness practices. Why these are important is that mindfulness allows people to start to manage their emotions. It's a direct pathway to emotional intelligence. And people can learn to sit with their feelings and be less triggered and reactive to things that might be upsetting. In other words, it gives you a little bit of control over your biology. So mindfulness is really powerful, and in addition to helping people more resilient and adaptable to change, it will reduce your healthcare costs. People are less sick. They are healthier generally when they engage in mindfulness. So mindfulness is something to encourage and look for ways to implement it into your company. We also want to celebrate milestones. The other mistake that leaders make is that we ask people to change and then we don't even mark it with a celebration. So we take away what reward there could have been for going through the change. Now, I'm not saying you give everyone a bonus, but you should have a pizza party, or you should have some kind of, I realize that's a hugely Western reference. You should have a great, banquet with all the right foods that your team would really be excited about. But and a time to just celebrate and high five. We did it. Look, we changed. But oftentimes we throw change at people. It's stressful, it's negative, it's hard. Lots of failure and anxiety in it. And then we don't even have a celebration that we got through it. So bring back celebrating milestones. And then finally, you want to leverage learning. Your learning partners, your learning and development professionals can be really active partners in doing all of these pieces and helping make sure these pieces are all available to your team. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So learning is vital. Some ways you want to leverage learning are, first of all, habit design. And I'm now in kind of the last couple components I'm giving you here. So we're going to move quickly into question and answer. But habit design, if you think about the change you're rolling out, you want to think about what habits are they currently doing that are well grooved and comfortable, and what habits do I need them to move to, and then help the training be part of helping them learn that new habit. In addition, you can build into your training programs emotional intelligence, and that can be part of what you offer to our individual contributors, managers, and leaders. You can also teach people change management, and there's change management from the leadership and manager side, and there's also change management from the individual contributor or employee side. We have courses on these in lynda.com. Problem solving, again, that can be a set of training you help people do, or you can set up structures or opportunities for people to engage in the problem solving process. And then finally, you can teach people some of the skills they need to be adaptable and resilient. You can give people mindfulness training. You can talk about how to track their own net effect of change and their own engagement so that they can be speaking to folks and letting folks know when they're getting maxed out. You can involve people in being able to manage the change in an effective way. So just a couple highlights here as I close out. Lynda.com has a lot of learning available to you. I have a list of recommended courses, and I'll send this recommended list to you after the webinar. But we have lots of great things: design thinking, embracing change, my course, the science of sales, etc. Lynda.com has some webinars as well. I've done several of those if you want to look more for some of my stuff. And then if you're interested in Lynda.com, you can reach out to the sales team. That's the presentation. Oh, I wanted to give a quick plug. I'm going to be speaking at ATD in May, so if any of you are making the trip out to Denver, Colorado in the US, I'll be doing 4 different trainings: blended learning, driving employee engagement and results, cracking the code, the future of talent development, and I'll be doing this presentation also in person with a little more content than what you got today, the Neuroscience of Change, and I'll also be doing a book signing for my book, Wired to Grow. All right, let's segue into questions and comments. And please connect with me on LinkedIn. And if you want to learn more about me, my website is also there. But I'm going to now stop sharing my screen so that Justin can walk us through the question and answer period.
Also joining the webinar today, we have industry experts from around the world. I'll just take a brief moment to introduce them. Jeff Ripp joins us from Australia, in the Institute of Learning Professionals, where he's research director. Here in Singapore, Angela Griffiths, director of L&D for Brookfield Global Relocation Services. Ivor Williamson, senior learning design manager, Standard Chartered Bank, and on again, off again is Jack, L&D manager at KPMG. We also have a number of students and staff from Temasek Polytechnic. You'll see them online as well. So during the remainder of the hour, I'd like to open things up, and Britt has kindly agreed to take some questions. First, if I could, from the panelists. And panelists, if you do have a question, I'd ask you to unmute yourself manually there. All right. Those watching remotely, send your questions through the chat box. I'll get those. I'll get those here.
Dr. Britt, my first question, I guess, was just really, you outlined in quite a lot of detail the biology that we're predisposed towards change. And I guess just a kind of simple question, we've created a world around us that is ever more connected, more volatile, and constantly changing. And we've created that change, and yet we're wholly resistant biologically to this numerous different changes. So what is the cognitive apparatus that we have that we want, that in some way we've contradicted ourselves by creating this much change that we are in ourselves resistant to?
Wow, that's the $10 million question. Well, it's the third part of what we want to do, right? We're wired to become. So in all of us, in addition to surviving and belonging, we're natural explorers. We want to explore, we want to create, we want to become our best selves. So if you think about what's driving all the change, is technology has outpaced our biology. But we created all that technology, right? Like the fact that I can even talk to you. I will never probably run into you in the real world. You're thousands of miles away from me, and yet I can see your eyebrows. And we're talking right now. So this technology is amazing, and yet it has actually outpaced our biology. And I think slowly we will evolve. And in addition, we have to have some boundaries with this technology that is faster, smarter, better in many ways than our biology to process it. And that's what we're coming up against. We're all having to find ways to take this amazing digital device that's a computer in our pocket and say no to it, put it down. It also brings great things, like the fact that I am more tuned into my fellow humans around the world, and I know what's happening in Syria, and I know what's happening in Brussels. That makes me feel more connected to my species. And so it brings about a lot of good things too, but we're at this place where we've created a lot, and that comes from our desire to create, and we've created something bigger than we can manage, and that's why we're feeling the stress of it right now. We'll work our way through it, but like all inventions, the first few cars that were designed too, people made a mess with driving those first few cars until they figured out, oh, we need stoplights. That would be a good idea.
Thank you for that question, Ivor. Angela, any question for you?
Fascinating, because so many of those things we experience, but I didn't realize that there was actually a biological reason for a lot of those things. So that's really useful to know and to take back into the workplace. Very interested in the use of mindfulness to integrate that into the workplace, and just wanted your thoughts on if there's any particular program you recommend, or your observations in companies that have introduced that, and how that has had an impact on change, and how employees have been more able to navigate that change.
Yeah, absolutely. So There's a researcher I would recommend you all check out. His name is Richard Davidson, and he's out of the University of Wisconsin. And he is the researcher who's putting people on MRI machines. So he puts Tibetan monks on MRI machines to look at what does the mindful brain look like and how is it different, right? And then he takes people who've never meditated and compares their brain. And there's big differences. So the mindful brain that has meditated seems to have some control over some of these biological wirings. There's far more resilient. They even put pain monitors and they introduce a shock of heat, and the people who've meditated a lot experience less pain, physical less pain, and they recover from pain quicker or stress quicker than someone who doesn't. What's really fascinating is, so there's a permanent change that happens in the brain on meditation, and they've taken someone who has never meditated ever in their life, they meditate one time for 10 minutes, and the brain is permanently changed. Permanently changed. So we are also wired to use wisdom practices, which is why every religious tradition in the world has some kind of mindfulness practice in it. It's like that's part of our biology too, and we're not totally tapping into the antidote right now, right? So the antidote is mindfulness. So there's incredible research, and I have to say, in reading the research, it made me a meditator, and I didn't think I would. It's totally changed me, and I love it. And for me, that's 20 minutes. And I listen to a guided meditation. Deepak Chopra and Oprah Winfrey have these 21-day, 20-minute things you can download to your phone. So I'm using technology for good, not evil. And it's made a difference. But how you can do it with companies is you can make that something that the company pays for, right? You can say, we're going to invest in some mindfulness tools and make them free and available. We're going to have some meditation classes here on campus. If you want to, you can take some of your perks and encourage people to explore mindfulness. The benefits you'll get are huge. Like anything, we can use our companies to promote behaviors we want to see. Just like we've kind of changed the number of people that drink and drive and the number of people that smoke in the world, we can change how many people are using mindfulness. The stand-up desk movement is another example. The more we have people stand up at their desks, that brings health benefits. So it's really just understanding the power of mindfulness and understanding it's not an extra foo-foo perk. It's really a core benefit you can bring to your company that will have a ripple effect in really great ways. And then you just want to create a culture where that's respected. If your leaders meditate or participate and they talk about it, that's going to promote other people doing it. Or if it's kind of, seen as silly, then that's going to affect if people take advantage of it. And then one more thing I would say, like LinkedIn our learning and development team just designed a self-paced online program for our employees to go through that was mindful. It's all about mindfulness. So we built a learning program around it. So you can go everything from just telling people about it and they go buy their own thing to building and designing your own stuff and everything in between. So cheap and easy, complex and expensive, you'll get great benefits no matter which place you start.
We had a question that comes in from Philip in Indonesia. He's asking whether where you've seen that profiling tools, Myers-Briggs or DISC, is there any relation to the brain functioning that you're talking about? Is there any measurement, so to speak?
Yeah, so great question. I teach Myers-Briggs and some of those profiling things. I actually haven't, the answer is I don't know. I actually haven't researched what brain structures are involved. All of those things measure a certain type of preference that we have in terms of how we see the world or how we process information. I've seen enough studies on them that I know that they're reliable and valid. But I haven't looked into the brain structures involved with them. But I would think it's related to, some of the stuff we talked about. I'm just guessing now, but, success and failure and what we learned, navigating social space, and then just the inherent stuff that makes us somewhat unique, right? We each have a unique personality, and it gets at, yeah, you're unique, but we can still type you into 16 categories. And that comes from just measuring enough people that you know that there's a pattern there.
Okay. I believe Jeff has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Britt, I have a question. I think it's an age-old problem. We know that people who go through our programs, our training courses, they come out pretty much what we would call not yet competent. They're definitely not proficient, and the only way we can develop their proficiency is to get them to go back to the workplace and to continue their learning journey in order to develop the proficiency levels that we require. Now, I guess as I see it, we're going back and asking them to make changes, but they're doing that in a world in which they're confronted by continuous change all the time that's distracting them. I'm really looking for some tips or ideas on how best to manage that process based on your research.
Yeah, great question. So I go into this in more detail in my book, so I encourage you to get it. It's on Amazon. But essentially, I started approaching learning, once I understood some of this stuff, I really got very focused on, I am a habit designer. And if you think about all the learning we roll out, ultimately we're trying to drive a behavior change of some kind. And so I started to get really focused on what are they currently doing and what rewards are they getting for doing it that way. And if I want to move them over here, I got to create a habit and I got to build in something that's equally compelling to get them to move. And then from a learning design perspective, so I get really clear about, so for example, I use situational leadership model. I'm sure many of us do, right? We teach that. Well, instead of just talking about it and saying, oh yeah, you're going to assess the competence and confidence of your team, I actually have created a handout where they take Bob, employee Bob, and they assess all these parts of Bob so that they know exactly where Bob is, and they do Maria and they do Sally in the room while I'm with them. So I set a timer and I make them do that in the room with me, because I know if I just tell them to do it when they get it back at their desk, they're not going to. The other thing I've done is I flipped the classroom. So to make time to do that hands-on practice in the room, I have them watch a lynda.com course before they come in the room, and they get the basic learning before they're with me. They can watch that at whatever time of day or night is convenient for them. Then when they're in the room, I'm focused on actually building the habit, whatever I want them to do. If we're talking about how to have a career conversation with an employee, I make them have the career conversation in the room where they can make mistakes in a supportive environment and do it at least once. And then the third thing I've done is I've broken my training. Instead of doing half and full days, I do 1 to 2 hour chunks. But I bring them back more often for those 1 to 2 hour chunks, because by pacing the learning that way, I'm actually building in opportunities to practice and I'm grooving the habit rather than giving them a whole lot of content in one day. So those are 3 things I've played with that I've had really great success with. There's more things to tinker with. And again, you know, some of that stuff's available in the materials I'll share with you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So if I understand you correctly, you're deliberately designing for building habits, and you're also consciously putting in a lot more practice than I guess typically happens in a lot of programs.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, yeah. This is a mistake that our whole industry is making. We need to strip down. We need to strip down and get really crisp about the behaviors and focus on the behaviors. And when we put our time there, we actually then shift the behaviors and we show better ROI to the organization. But you know, it takes skill to do that. It gets better. Like anything, it gets better with practice, right? I'm better at it now because I've been doing it for a while. But you too can start to map that and really focus on doing it in the room.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Good.
Okay, well, time has caught up with us, and it's with much regret I need to bring this engaging session to a close. Britt, thank you so much. We got a bit of theory, some practical pointers, and I can probably speak for the panelists, you know, some interest in looking into the subject more. Really appreciate the session. Panelists, thanks for the great questions. And to all our viewers out there, thanks so much for joining today's webinar, brought to you by STADA and the Center for Transcultural Studies at Temasek Polytechnic. Now remember to check out Britt's book, Wired to Grow, on Amazon, and her courses on lynda.com. Visit the STADA website as well, stada.org.sg, for the archive of previous webinars. And for those of you who will be in Singapore on the evening of 19 April, we'll be having a networking event where regional learning leaders from Twitter and Vodafone will be sharing their best practices. You can find more info on that as well on stada.org.sg. Now, as one of my favorite authors, Dr. Zeus, once said, you have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes. You can steer yourself any direction you choose. Now, as we heard from Britt today, those sentiments do hold true. So on that note, it's Justin Scott signing off from the Global Connect Village at Temasek Polytechnic in Singapore. So we'll meet again at the next webinar in June. I'm going to encourage you in your quest to lead and navigate change with some words from another wise fellow. All right, a bend in the road isn't the end of the road unless you fail to make the turn.
Nice.
For that, and goodbye.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Anton.